The sun, a relentless Texas hammer, had not yet reached its zenith, but the dust already hung thick and hot over the acres Elijah Vance called his own. It was a good dust, a dust earned. It smelled of sun-baked earth, of the hardy native grasses his small herd of cattle thrived on, of freedom. Elijah stood at the edge of his land, his boots planted firmly in the soil he had poured his savings, his sweat, and his soul into. He was a man carved from quiet resilience, his hands telling a story of decades of labor, his eyes holding the deep, patient wisdom of generations who understood that land was more than dirt, it was legacy. But today, his gaze was fixed not on the sprawling beauty of his ranch, but on a stark, brutal line of gleaming white vinyl that cut across his horizon. A fence. It was tall, impersonal, and utterly defiant, erected not to keep his cattle in, but, as the certified letter in his hand had coldly informed him, to keep his property, and by extension, him, separate from the pristine, manicured world of the Rolling Hills Community Association. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. It cited aesthetic noncompliance and preservation of community standards. It mentioned unapproved livestock and potential nuisance. But Elijah could read the subtext in the sterile lawyer speak as clearly as he could read the tracks of a coyote in the mud. He was the noncompliance. His presence was the nuisance. He had refused their offers, lowball numbers disguised as generosity, to buy him out. He had politely declined their suggestions that he sell his breeding pair of prized black Angus to avoid the sight and smell. His refusal to be moved, to be assimilated into their vision of bland homogeneity, had been met not with dialogue, but with a wall. The fence severed his direct access to the main county road, the only convenient route for his trucks, his vet, his freedom to come and go as he pleased. The only gate, a heavy, industrial strength thing with a formidable lock, was on their property, and the key resided in the pocket of HOA president Carl Henderson. Elijah remembered the meeting where it had been decided. He'd sat in a sterile conference room surrounded by faces that looked nothing like his own, their expressions a mix of impatient irritation and veiled hostility. Henderson, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, had spoken of property values and shared community vision. "It's nothing personal, Elijah," he'd said, the condescension dripping like poison. "It's just business. We have a responsibility to our homeowners." And in that moment, Elijah felt the weight of a history he knew all too well. It was the same business that had redlined his grandparents out of certain neighborhoods. The same business that had used covenants to keep people who looked like him from owning land at all. This fence was just the latest tool in an old, ugly toolbox, a modern-day Jim Crow barricade dressed up in suburban respectability. The message was clear. You may own the land, but you will never be one of us. You will enter and exit on our terms, with our permission. The anger that rose in him was a cold, solid thing, but beneath it was a profound, aching sorrow. He had served his country, built a successful business from nothing, and saved for 20 years to buy this slice of the American dream, only to have a committee tell him he was dreaming wrong. For days, a storm raged within him. He felt the urge to confront, to scream, to tear the vile thing down with his bare hands. But the lessons of his father, a man of deep and principled restraint, echoed in his mind. "Son," he'd say, "a man who reacts in anger is a man who's already lost. You win with the mind God gave you. You fight with the rules they wrote, and you play a longer game than they can ever imagine." So Elijah swallowed his rage. He began taking the long, grueling detour through backcountry roads, adding 40 minutes to every trip, watching his fuel costs skyrocket, his patience thinning with every jarring mile. He saw the smug satisfaction on Henderson's face the one time their vehicles passed near the gate, Henderson in his shiny SUV, barely affording Elijah a glance. The humiliation was a daily acid drip, but Elijah was watching. He was learning, and he was planning. It was during one of these interminable detours that he noticed the for sale sign. It wasn't on a house, but on a narrow, neglected strip of land that ran between the western edge of the Rolling Hills community and the old Miller property. It was a leftover parcel, all scrub brush and rocky soil, deemed useless by everyone. But Elijah's eyes, trained by a lifetime of seeing value where others saw waste, saw something else. He saw its location. His heart began to pound with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the rough road. He pulled over, dust clouding around his truck, and made a call. His realtor, an old friend named Maria, who had helped him find his ranch, was skeptical. "Elijah, that's a junk lot. It's not good for anything. Just get me the surveys, Maria," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Get me all the historical plats for that area. Everything." The documents arrived, and Elijah spread them out on his large oak table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs. He pored over them late into the night, under the soft glow of a single lamp. Deed lines, easements, century-old right-of-ways, it was a complex puzzle. And then he found it. His finger traced a line on a faded plat map from 1922. The old county road, now mostly grown over but still a legally recorded easement, had run directly through that very strip of land. The modern road used by the Rolling Hills community had been built later, a convenience that had made the old easement obsolete but not extinct. A fire began to kindle behind his weary eyes. He called Maria back. "I want to make an offer on the strip lot. Full asking price. No contingencies." The urgency in his voice brooked no argument. The purchase was swift and quiet. He became the owner of 5 acres of what everyone else considered worthless desert. But Elijah Vance now held the deed to a secret, a piece of history everyone else had forgotten. And he was just getting started. The next property was the key, the old Miller place. It was a rundown house on a large lot that backed directly onto the Rolling Hills community. And, most importantly, it contained the sole maintenance access point for the community's water pump station. It was also, he discovered through Maria, in pre-foreclosure. The owner, an elderly man who had moved away, had fallen deeply behind on his payments. The bank was eager to be rid of it. This was the gamble, the all-in moment. This would require mortgaging his own ranch, leveraging everything he had built. It was a terrifying risk. He walked his land that night, the stars a brilliant, cold blanket overhead. He thought of his ancestors, who had risked everything for a chance at freedom, for a plot of land they could call their own. This was his fight. This was their fight. The next morning, he instructed Maria to make the offer. The waiting was an agony. But when the call came, her voice was bright with triumph. "It's yours, Elijah." The bank accepted. "You now own the old Miller property." Elijah closed his eyes. He didn't cheer. He simply took a deep, shuddering breath, the weight on his shoulders shifting from one of oppression to one of immense responsibility. He had just bought the property that held the only key to their kingdom. Now, it was time to change the locks. The lawyers he hired were expensive, sharp, and utterly ruthless. They specialized in property law and, as one of them put it with a thin smile, resolving territorial disputes. They filed the necessary paperwork, quietly and efficiently. Elijah Vance was now the legal owner of the easement for the old county road that ran through his newly acquired strip of land. And he was the owner of the property containing the HOA's vital water pump station. The final piece of his plan was a masterpiece of legal poetry. He had a new gate installed on the border of his strip lot, where the old easement met the county road. It was a gate even more imposing than the one the Hoe had built. And then he waited. The first sign of trouble for Rolling Hills came when a community water main burst. The maintenance crew, led by a frantic Carl Henderson, rushed to the pump station access gate, only to find a new, massive chain and a state-of-the-art combination lock securing it. They couldn't get in to shut off the water. Panicked calls were made. They called the number on the new "No Trespassing" sign, which listed the holding company Elijah's lawyers had set up. The message was relayed to Elijah. He waited 3 hours, as geysers of water erupted on the perfectly manicured lawns of rolling hills before he returned the call. Henderson was practically screaming, "Who is this? We have an emergency. We need access to our pump station now." Elijah's voice was calm, ice cold. "This is Elijah Vance. I understand you have a situation. Access to that property is now restricted. I'd be happy to discuss a right-of-way agreement for emergency services. My lawyers will send over the draft." The silence on the other end of the line was more satisfying than any outburst could have been. The real crisis, however, arrived with the garbage trucks. The entire community's sanitation service relied on a route that used a private road that, according to the new surveys Elijah's lawyers had filed with the county, now had a contested ownership claim. It technically belonged to Elijah's strip lot. As the sun rose on trash day, the residents of Rolling Hills came out to find their bins full and untouched. And sitting squarely across the entrance to their neighborhood was that formidable new gate, locked tight. The outrage was immediate and volcanic. An emergency home meeting was called that evening. Elijah received a formal, and this time, deeply respectful, request for his attendance. He arrived not in his work truck, but in a clean suit, driving a car he'd borrowed from Maria. He walked into the same conference room, but this time he did not take a seat at the table. He stood at the head of it. The room fell silent. Henderson's face was pale, his earlier bluster completely deflated. He began to splutter about unreasonable behavior, about lawsuits. Elijah let him talk. When Henderson finally ran out of steam, Elijah placed a single folder on the table. "Carl," he said, his voice quiet but filling the room, "you told me once that this was just business. You were right." He opened the folder. "I now own the easement for the old county road that you built your community fence on. I own the property containing your water access. And I own the land your sanitation route depends on. You surrounded me with a fence, but you forgot to check what was on the other side of your own maps." He looked at each of the board members in turn, seeing the dawning horror in their eyes. "You wanted to control how I entered and exited my world. Now, you will need my permission to enter and exit yours." He laid out his terms. The fence around his property was to be dismantled within 72 hours. The HOA would sign a permanent, irrevocable easement granting him full access through their property to the main road. Furthermore, they would cover all his legal fees. In return, he would grant them access rights for their water and sanitation. It was not a negotiation. It was a settlement. They had no leverage, no legal ground to stand on. They had tried to cage him, and in doing so, they had handed him the keys to their own gilded prison. The vote was unanimous. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly outmaneuvered, they signed the papers he presented. The next morning, Elijah stood once more on his land. The sound was beautiful. The grinding and cranking of machinery as work crews hired by the HOA began to tear down the hateful white fence. With every post they pulled from the earth, he felt a weight lifting, not just from his ranch, but from his soul. He watched as the unobstructed view of the rolling hills was restored, the barrier between his legacy and their exclusion erased. He hadn't just won a fight over property lines. He had defended his dignity. He had taken their symbol of oppression and revealed it for what it always was, a testament to their own small-mindedness and his own immeasurable strength. He had played the long game, and he had won not with fury, but with foresight, not with confrontation, but with cunning. The sun warmed his face, and the good dust of his ancestors settled around him. He was home, and the gate was now and forever his.